All right, let's bring it in. What'd you guys talk about? Anything profound come out of that time of reading A Mighty Fortress is Our God?
I find it super interesting that a lot of these verses focus on how terrible the devil is, as opposed to like how great the Lord is. I guess it makes me like if we left the first verse without the second verse, we'd be like, well, I'm really confused about why we're singing about that, because the first verse ends with like, well, we're kind of in trouble, and we need the second verse to say, but Christ, but God, and I think that it's very accurate to how our hearts may respond to suffering or how we deal. But I just thought it was really, it's almost like you can't leave parts of this out, or it doesn't really feel like we're not worshiping anymore, we're just whining,
Yeah, so, that's really cool. Yeah, when you get to like the B section of verse 1, where it's like, for still our ancient foe, in one of the versions it says, doth, the Nard does that mean? Doth seek to work us woe, his craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate on earth is not his equal.
Yeah, that last line is like,
but it's so true. Like, imagine the suffering that he's going through. He got excommunicated from the Catholic Church. They tried to kill him. Pretty much Frederick the Wise, who was like the governor over his little province, saved him by kidnapping him, like hung him up in a castle pretty much for like years. Couldn't see his family. Then Black Plague sweeps through. The Catholic Church kind of forgets about him. And now he's pastoring a church during immense suffering. It's like his life was terrible, but awesome nonetheless. But yeah, I think it's true. Like, how many times do we actually acknowledge that the devil, Satan, the evil one, his power is actually greater than ours? And verse 2 actually, the A section, if we abide in our own strength, we lose, But it's so cool. Like, I just love that section. I think it's so cool. Like, acknowledging that, Imagine waking up and praying, like, God, without you, I lose today, Like, in my own strength, if I confide, like, my striving is losing, It's pretty wild. Anything else?
I think it's cool to, like, read things like this because, it's old language, but it's so relatable.
Yeah.
And, the Bible's really old, and I think sometimes we can get so used to it, we read it, and we feel maybe a personal disconnection from it, in the sense of, like, how can I relate to David? Like, this is all crazy stuff that no one does anymore. And even that was a long time ago. If we were to talk to this writer, we would probably barely be able to communicate, because our experiences would be so different. But we can read this and be like, yep, I feel that.
Yep.
So I think that's really cool, and it just kind of shows how persistent the church is.
Yeah, that's cool. One more person. Anything else?
I think like the question that you're asking, how do you typically deal with suffering in your life? I'm not writing songs.
Yeah.
Like, I'm probably curled up in my bed crying.
Yeah.
There's certainly other ways that I've dealt with suffering.
Yeah.
That shame, guilt, all that stuff just kind of comes in and just kind of isolated.
Yep.
And he's writing a song, that's like changing the world.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so cool. Imagine being one of the people that stayed in whatever town in Europe, and you walk into church on Sunday, and Martin Luther's sitting there, and your neighbor just died from the Black Plague, and then your other neighbor's sick with the Black Plague and is probably going to die. Martin Luther's daughter just died, and you potentially probably will die. You walk into church, and you just sing A Mighty Fortress is Our God, Like, so powerful. And it's so cool. Like, this is one of the 50-ish. He wrote about 47 hymns. And this is one of them. And it was one of the 50 that was in the German language, in the language of the people, which for 1,000 years, like we talked about, songs weren't in their own language. People were still illiterate. But even as you leave the church service, you can sing this song, even if you can't read. And, like, experience, think about deep truths of God in the middle of immense suffering. You know, like how cool. The first time ever, like since like the 5th century, 1,000 years. Like awesome. So to summarize, you gotta keep moving. The church was doing this Latin thing for like 1,000 years. Not super helpful to the lay people because no one speaks Latin except for the priest, kind of. The hocus pocus thing. Luther shows up to the party, translates the Bible into German, so the vernacular of the people, and then writes about 50 hymns in the common language as well. So he's pairing theology, doxology, and then it's from his hymnal work that we get "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." Okay, songs taught people who God was, all that kind of stuff. And music, actually at the Protestant Reformation, about 100 years before, became a massive thing. Once the Protestant Reformation hit, music was the essential tool on pairing like doxology and theology, people knowing God, because people were illiterate, right? When people couldn't read or write, they could sing to a melody, right? So Luther began this movement of writing these theologically deep songs for people who couldn't read their Bibles. Consider this as like we go into our quiet times every day, or we attend like a Sunday church service that's in our own language, and we can worship God. We owe a great deal to faithful men and women who wrote and like were catalysts for this movement that we are like a product of today. It's so cool. And the work of Luther is incredibly influential, and his work went far past his life. But I think, what does that have to do with us now? So now we're going to move into kind of the second question that I asked prior, which is, what do we do now, right? We've covered some history. Now here we are, 21st century. We're great. Yeehaw. In light of kind of the history we've gone through, like back to the question I kind of asked prior at the very beginning is, why do you think it's good and right to continue to create music? Okay? I want you to think about that. Don't answer it now. But like, why do you think it's good and right to make music? Okay? Cool. Now we'll keep going. C.S. Lewis, y'all have this quote or parts of it in your handout. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity talks about this idea of each generation being situated or fixed, having a situated or fixed perspective on how they see the world. I was reading this book this week, and this guy named Justo Gonzalez says that we're born with sunglasses on our eyes, and the fact is most of us forget that the glasses are on our eyes, so we see the world through this tinted lens. Okay, so he says the job of the Christian, especially the Christian, but anyone in the postmodern age, is to at least acknowledge that the glasses are there. Okay, so like we see the world a certain way. We are a product of our generation, right? Which is really cool. So C.S. Lewis goes on to say that each generation is good at seeing certain truths, but liable to miss others. Okay, we're going to focus on the front half of that, so good at seeing certain truths. And I quote Lewis to make the point that each generation has its own song, has its own style, and has its own voice. Okay, each generation has its own song, own style, own voice. Like Luther, the Puritans, Edwards, like all these people, music has taken so many different forms. Even when we're talking about, y'all said something about it as well. Like later, right? Somebody said something about Isaac Watts, Amazing Grace. Like later, Puritan, right? Like, so music's taken all these different forms, and it's because each generation is good at seeing certain truths, right? And liable to miss others, but good at seeing certain truths, right? Like, there's a certain way that each generation thinks about God and certain methodology or ways that they approach thinking, right? Systems. So, songs about certain things and certain styles are influenced by the culture we live in, whether it's Christian or secular. I listened to this guy in this sermon when I first started doing worship stuff. Hank sent me, I think it was Hank, I don't remember. He sent me this YouTube video, and it was this dude at the Stone. His name's Jesse Reeves. He wrote the song. He writes a lot of stuff with Chris Tomlin. The Stone album, he wrote like Jesus True and Only and If y'all know those songs, they're old. But he writes a bunch of songs, and he said he was like giving this big emotional speech, and he was like, "You want to know what the best, like the next big Christian album's gonna sound like?" He was like, "Just go listen to Coldplay. Like it's gonna sound like that." When I was like, "Wow, that's rough," and he said it in like a negative way, but like it's not negative, you know. I think this can ruffle some feathers. I was talking to Davis and Seth, and it was like, for me specifically, I'm skeptical about like new stuff. Like I'm like kind of on the fence. Even coming into like residency, I was real like this is kind of how I do things, and I'm not really for like new stuff. It like this stuff's been tested and tried. New stuff hasn't, you know. So when we were comparing Be Thou My Vision and where I'm standing now, it's like, whoa, you know. So it's like it's hard for me, but I think slowly learning that like if we don't step into the new stuff, then we forget about our generation altogether, you know? So it's been this awesome learning curve. I'm going to move on. Cool. So take, for example, like Be Thou My Vision. It's not like, back to that Jesse Reeves quote, like listen to Coldplay, the next big worship album. Like Be Thou My Vision, just a little history about that song. It was an old bar tune that they sang while they were getting hammered. They were singing this old folk bar tune. And the writer of Be Thou My Vision paired this old bar tune with these rich theological truths about God. Does that make sense? Isn't that awesome? So it's not a bad thing for music, like Christian music, to sound like culture music, you know, in terms of sound. Back to the question, like, is it bad that like we take what the culture likes hearing or our generation likes hearing and we pair it with deep theology about God? No, it's absolutely necessary. Luther did it. Every single hymn writer after him did it. So we in our generation do it as well, like to communicate to our generation. We've moved from like just having this, even in our own past like 200 years, we've moved from having like an organ, like a piano player and a choir at like your regular Joe old Southern Baptist church. Remember like that time when drums were of the devil, you know, speaking of ancient foe. And now it's weird. Like if we were to walk into church on Sunday and there was like everybody up there except a drummer, we'd be like, something's wrong, you know. Somebody didn't schedule well, or something, you know. Literally when we write songs, what's even funnier, when we write songs, we'll be like in the middle, we'll be like on the piano over here playing guitar, and I'll like turn to someone and I'll be like, oh yeah, on the bridge we need to have like a cool tom fill or something. We haven't even written the bridge yet, you know, but we're like thinking about the music already. So like the style of music has a massive influence on even how we write, which is really cool. So kind of summarizing that, like it's necessary to like intermingle the way culture likes the sound with deep theological truths about God, right? And that's kind of the point of the Luther thing. So now there's this quote by C.S. Lewis, and he says, "We are all rightly distressed and ashamed also at the divisions of Christendom." He's specifically talking about like denominations, differences and stuff. "But those who have always lived within the Christian fold may be too easily dispirited by them. They are bad, but such people do not know what it looks like from without. Seen from there, what is left intact, despite all the divisions, still appears, as it truly is, an immensely formidable unity." So I think when we think about like room for new expressions, it's like specifically when it comes to creating music and writing songs, all that stuff, like there has to be room, right? And in that, as we write new songs, so take songs like Be Thou My Vision, Where I'm Standing Now, there's this incredible unity, formidable unity, kind of like C.S. Lewis talks about, inside of it, because we're all like singing to the same God, you know? So it's like it's so cool how the truth can transcend the culture while the music still changes, you know? Again, that's awesome. So there has to be room for fluidity, right? In how we do worship, how we approach writing songs. No one type of worship is right or wrong per se. As long as the church believes in like the orthodox kind of tenets of the faith, like sing however you want, you know, doesn't matter. I think a question to ask is like, would your grandparents enjoy coming to do worship at Redeemer? You know, My grandparents would not. They'd be having their earplugs in, and my grandpa would turn his like hearing aids off and wait for the sermon. You know, like he would not listen to the music. But then on the other side of that, when you go to your grandparents' church, maybe your grandparents' church is different than mine, but I'm thinking about mine. Like, do you enjoy the music? You know, maybe. I do. I think it's awesome. It's kind of weird, but it's great. But even in the middle, if I don't like the sound, I could still think about the truth, you know, which is super cool. So if we think about it, we're going to be our grandparents' church one day, right, when our generation passes, and then the next takes over. So there's kind of two things that I want to push, and as we think about and kind of wrap this thing up, is that the first thing we need to do is understand our perspective and acknowledge the fact that we've got sunglasses on, right? Kind of back with that metaphor. We're influenced. Our generation is influenced. We're a product of our generation. So realize you have sunglasses on. And the second is to acknowledge and recognize the push to see that the necessity, what am I trying to say? There is a necessity in creating, right? And in communicating to our generation. Okay? I'm going to repeat that. There's a necessity to create and communicate to our generation. We have to do it. Okay? And literally, it's not so we can write some song like Amazing Grace. Like, we're not trying to write some song that transcends time, you know? We're trying to write a song for our specific generation, just like all of them were doing. The guy who wrote It Is Well, in the middle of suffering, wrote the song for his generation. It just so happened that it transcends, you know? Like, how cool. So, we've gone over God's people being a singing people. We've talked about the history of the church and worship. And lastly, we just got done talking about how we're tasked to communicate to our current generation. So, the response is to continue to write, continue to create, because it's good for us, it's good for our generation, and may God grant us the grace to be faithful with the task at hand. That's all I have